As a rule, when an outlet that calls itself news is owned by a government, particularly an authoritarian government, news organizations identify it as being state-owned. At least they're supposed to. Listen to how NPR accurately described sources of information from Iran and China, Russia, and Afghanistan. In each case, that was accurate. These are state-owned outlets providing information, and you need to know that. I'm starting with NPR because NPR got into a dispute about this same issue last year. Elon Musk owns Twitter, now called X. He slapped these labels onto certain news outlets, including NPR, as state-affiliated media. In reality, a small percentage of NPR's funding is public. The overwhelming majority, as you probably know, comes from donations, especially those that come in during pledge drives. I used to do a lot of airtime during my NPR days, getting people to call in during pledge drives. If you want to see the numerical breakdowns of NPR funding, I'll make that available in the newsletter. But the key here is what happened between NPR and Twitter. All right, and I promise this will come right back to Al Jazeera. Follow me here. So, NPR is a private nonprofit. So, a lot of people at NPR, including executives, understandably got angry at Twitter, and the network announced that it would stop using its Twitter channels in response. Individuals at NPR still use Twitter, but the organizational accounts stopped. NPR discussed this on the air. Here's a clip from one segment they did. NPR brought in media correspondent David Folkenflik. And listen to what host Leila Fadel added here. That's a fair point. It can be dangerous to get this wrong. That's another reason that news organizations themselves should make sure that they're accurate in reporting about these issues. And as I played for you just a minute ago, NPR does say state media when it's state-owned media, particularly in nations that don't have democratic freedom of expression. But not always. There is a prominent exception. The Muslim Brotherhood, by the way, is the organization that spawned Hamas. The terrorist organization is an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood. Anyway, what you just heard is one of many reports in which Al Jazeera is discussed with no mention of it being a Qatari state-owned news agency. This also happens often when NPR discusses Al Jazeera in the context of Israel. That one is a 4-minute story with a bunch of references to Al Jazeera and no mention of it being state-owned news. Now, sometimes you do hear Qatar mentioned, and the wording is very interesting. Qatar financed. That sounds so much less concerning than Qatar owned, but it is owned by Qatar. In fact, the U.S. State Department notes this in its current human rights report about Qatar. I was curious to see how Al Jazeera covered this dispute between NPR and Twitter. And I saw a line in their written story on their website that is clever. Here's what Al Jazeera wrote. Quote, "The new label has not been added to some other state-funded media, including Al Jazeera and France 24, which are funded by the Qatari and French governments respectively." Okay, when I saw that, I was like, oh, I see what you're doing there. Clever. This is a perfect example of something that I've talked about before on this show. In order to have truth, you need two things: facts plus context. But you don't have the truth until you get the context. So it is a fact that France 24 is also government-owned. Yep. But context is crucial. A news outlet being owned by a democratic government like France is very different from a news outlet being owned by an authoritarian government. In a democracy, government officials have to try to appeal to the people to get their votes. And the people can demand legitimate reporting from the media. The people can choose to elect leaders who will then give the media the independence to cover stuff. You know, the BBC gets the bulk of its funding from a license fee paid by the public. The BBC also gets incredibly critical against its own government. When you have a democratic system, there is a level of media freedom that does not exist without that democratic system. Now, I'm not saying it's a perfect system. People could absolutely complain that these outlets don't do enough one way or the other. I myself have pointed to huge flaws with the BBC. not being pro the British government. In fact, in a way, the opposite. If you listen to my episode on using the word terrorism, you'll hear that the BBC has been trying to ignore calls by British leaders to call Hamas what it is, a terrorist organization. Actually, the BBC is among the worst offenders in that respect, refusing to use it when Israelis are attacked, but using it all over the world. Anyway, it's very different from when a quote-unquote news outlet like Al Jazeera is owned by a non-democratic government. Remember these words that we just heard in that NPR clip? Every year, there's something called the Democracy Index. It looks at governments all over the world. I recently mentioned it in a two-parter that I did about Jordan in response to a listener's request. Qatar is on the index also. And out of 167 countries, Qatar is ranked all the way down at 111. It's listed as authoritarian. Meanwhile, if you look at the U.S. State Department's latest human rights report about Qatar, here's a little bit of what you'll see. The law prohibits criticism of the emir. The emir, by the way, is the ruler, or as Qatar itself puts it, the monarch. Qatari law restricts the establishment of news outlets and lets the government close outlets and confiscate their assets. Here's a quote from the Human Rights Report. Quote, members of the ruling family or proprietors who enjoyed close ties to government officials owned all print media. Both private and government-owned television and radio reflected government views. Here's one more quote. Some observers and former Al Jazeera employees alleged the government influenced the content produced by that news outlet. The Qatar Media Corporation, the Ministry of Culture, and customs officials censored material, etc., etc., etc. Some people who work for Al Jazeera English try really hard to pretend that it's somehow totally different from Al Jazeera in Arabic. But it's the same outlet owned by the government of Qatar. And by the way, how it operates each day doesn't have any effect on whether or not it's state-owned. So the rule about telling people that it's state-owned in your coverage would obviously still apply.